Once upon a time, at the edge of a whispering forest, a widow lived with her 2 daughters. The elder, Clarice, was as sharp and glittering as a pin, proud, quick to scold, and very sure of herself. The younger, Marianne, was gentle-eyed and steady-hearted, the kind of girl who remembered the names of birds and hummed while she worked. Their cottage was small and ivy-kissed, with a garden of herbs that Marianne tended every morning. Though coins were few, the scent of rosemary and thyme drifted through the rooms, and the hills poured gold over the roof at sunset. Still, inside the walls, peace was scarce. The widow adored Clarice and excused every cutting word with a smile. Marianne wore mended dresses and did the chores without complaint. "Stop dreaming, Marianne," her mother would snap. "The clouds don't boil the soup." Marianne only nodded and stirred the pot. She had learned that kindness was the only armor she needed. One summer afternoon, when the air trembled with heat and crickets sang like tiny fiddles, the water jar in the cottage stood empty. "To the far well," the widow ordered, "beyond the orchard. Take the big jug, don't dawdle." It was nearly a mile, and the path ran through dry grass and prickly thorns, but Marianne lifted the heavy jug, tied a kerchief over her hair, and set off. At the old stone well, her arms wobbled with tiredness. She drew the cool bucket up, filled her jug, and sat on the smooth edge to rest her feet. "My dear child," came a faint voice, "might I trouble you for a sip of water?" "Of course," said Marianne at once. "This heat is dreadful." She rinsed the jug, filled it fresh, and held it out to an old woman whose eyes shone like polished chestnuts. The woman drank in slow, grateful sips. "You are too kind," the old woman said. "Not many would serve a stranger so sweetly." "It's nothing," Marianne replied. "You were thirsty, and I was here." "It is not nothing," said the old woman, and oh, the air shimmered around her like moonlight on a pond. In a blink, the worn shawl and cracked shoes became a gown that seemed woven from starlight. The old woman was gone. In her place stood a fairy. Marianne's eyes widened. I didn't know." "You did not need to know," said the fairy. "Kindness is best when it expects no trumpet and no thanks. For your pure heart, I give a small mirror of it to the world. From this day forth, each time you speak, flowers and jewels will fall from your lips. Let it remind you that words can plant gardens. Speak with care." Before Marianne could find a thank you worthy of such a gift, the fairy smiled and faded into the summer glare like a breath on glass. Marianne hurried home with the water and a heart dancing in her chest. The widow and Clarice were waiting, impatient. "At last," said her mother. "Did you fall asleep at the well? Give me—" "I'm sorry I'm late," Marianne began, and plink! A diamond rolled onto the floor. Then a pearl. Then a small pink rose unfurled at her feet. Clarice squeaked. Marianne clapped a hand to her mouth in surprise, and a sapphire bounced merrily into her apron. "Diamonds! Flowers!" cried the widow, eyes gone wide as coins. "Tell me everything." So Marianne told them of the well, and with each gentle word, pearls and lilies pattered softly to the floor, sparkling and blooming as if her voice had turned into springtime. The widow scooped jewels into her apron with shaking hands, her mind racing. "Clarice," she said at last, gripping her elder daughter's arm, "you must go at once. Do exactly as your sister did. Be polite, smile. We shall be twice as fortunate." Clarice was not fond of walking in the sun or of fetching water, which she called servant work, but the glittering heap on the table softened her opinion. "Very well," she sniffed, tying on a ribboned bonnet. "I shall be polite, very polite." She muttered, kindly, kindly, all the way, but the dust clung to her shoes, and the heat pricked her temper like nettles. At the well, a figure appeared, the very image of a princess, with shining hair and a dress that shimmered. It was, of course, the fairy again, wearing a different face. "Good day," said the fairy princess, her voice like a bell. "Might I trouble you for a sip of water?" Clarice glanced at the jug and lifted her chin. "I did not come to serve strangers," she replied. "If you're thirsty, draw your own." "You would deny water to one who thirsts?" the fairy asked gently. "I would deny it to anyone who takes me for a maid," Clarice said. "I have my own business." "Then," said the fairy, with a sigh that rustled like leaves, "you shall be rewarded according to your heart." Clarice blinked. "What nonsense!" she muttered, and started home. The widow met her at the door. "Well, did you meet her? What did she say?" "Some woman begged for water, but I sent her plop." A plump toad leapt from Clarice's mouth and landed on the hearthrug. Clarice clapped a hand to her lips. "What is plip?" 2 more toads hopped out, each croaking indignantly. A little garden snake slid after them like a ribbon come to life and disappeared under the cupboard. "Make it stop!" cried Clarice, eyes brimming. But every angry word popped out as another toad. Soon the room wobbled with croaks and soft, startled hisses. Clarice fell silent, trembling. The widow stared from the hopping creatures to her daughters, her thoughts tumbling faster than the jewels had. Fear twisted with anger. "This is your doing," she accused Marianne. "You've ruined us. Out, go." "Mother, please," Marianne said softly. A handful of daisies and small pearls fell at her feet, shining like tears. "I meant no harm." But the widow, frightened and overwhelmed, waved her away. The sun was touching the treetops when Marianne stepped onto the road, her bundle small, her heart heavy, but brave. Not far along, a carriage came into view, white horses tossing their manes, the king's crest gleaming on the door. Inside sat the prince, returning from a hunt, his cloak dusty and his eyes kind. "Stop," he told the driver. He leaned out. "Young woman, are you in need of help?" "No trouble, my lord," said Marianne, steadying her voice. "Only sorrow." As she spoke, a scatter of pearls and lilies drifted onto the roadside grass. The prince stared, amazed and delighted, as if the afternoon had decided to turn into a story. "By all the bells in the tower," he whispered. He stepped down, came closer, and, most importantly, listened. They talked like old friends meeting for the first time. With every word Marianne spoke, small blossoms and bright stones appeared, but it was the warmth in her voice that enchanted him. "Please," said the prince at last, "come with me. My parents must meet the maiden whose words are gardens." Marianne hesitated. The forest rustled. The carriage wheels waited. She looked up at the prince, and the gentleness in his eyes felt like a promise. She climbed in. At the palace, the king and queen welcomed her in a hall that echoed with wonder. When Marianne curtsied and offered a greeting, diamonds winked across the marble floor like stars deciding to come down for a visit. Courtiers gasped and whispered. The queen's gaze softened into a smile. "What grace," she said, "what kindness." "If she will have me," the prince said, heart pounding like drums at a festival, "let me be her reward." The king studied Marianne, the way she stood, not proud but unafraid, the way she looked around with curiosity and care. Then he nodded. "A woman whose words plant flowers will help a kingdom bloom." And so Marianne and the prince were married. Her gown shimmered like moonlight on water. When she spoke her vows, petals drifted down as if the ceiling were a secret orchard. The people loved her, not because jewels sparkled at her feet, but because she remembered names, asked after grandmothers, and laughed with her whole face. The palace found itself tidier, kinder, brighter, as if a window had been opened and spring blew in. Meanwhile, in the village, life was not easy at the ivy cottage. Clarice kept her lips pressed tight for fear of toads, and the widow paced, wringing her hands. Neighbors tiptoed past the door. Without kind words, the rooms felt colder. One evening, Clarice crept back to the old well. She stood where the stone was cool and the air smelled like mint and dust. A traveler approached, pink-faced with thirst. "Please," he said, "is this the way to the village? Might I have a sip of water?" Clarice felt the old prickles of pride, but the tired worry on the man's face tugged at something new. She drew water and handed it over. "Here," she said, careful and soft. A toad tumbled out, plop, and blinked up at her. But this one, small and green as a leaf, turned at once into a lily pad that floated on the surface of the bucket, blooming with a tiny white flower. Clarice stared. She tried again. "You're welcome." Another little frog hopped out and, poof, became a smooth pebble shaped like a heart. From the shadows came a familiar rustle. The fairy stood by the well, neither beggar nor princess now, but simply herself, wearing a smile that was both proud and kind. She said, "Gifts answer the heart that gives them," she said. "You were sharp because you were afraid of being small. But no one is small who makes room for others." Tears prickled Clarice's eyes. "I was unkind," she whispered. A tiny toad hopped out and became a crocus. "I'm sorry." "The spell is a teacher," said the fairy. "Each cruel word will still bring a toad. Each kind word a flower. Choose your garden, child." Clarice nodded. She began to practice. At first, she stumbled, but she learned to speak gently to neighbors and to listen without rolling her eyes. Soon, when she opened her mouth, out fell ladybugs, clover, and, sometimes, a single startled frog, which she would scoop up and carry to the pond, laughing at herself. Back at the cottage, the widow grew quieter. She had hugged her anger so hard that it had left a mark. One morning, she set her apron aside and walked to the palace gates. When Marianne came out to the courtyard, the queen still kept the habit of plain dresses on mornings with sun. The widow twisted her hands. "I was wrong," she said, voice shaking. Pearls and petals drifted to the stones at Marianne's feet, and the widow stared at the soft little shower as if it were rain in a dry season. "I loved badly. Forgive me." Marianne's eyes filled. "I missed you, Mother," she said simply, and daisies opened like smiles along the path between them. She invited her mother and Clarice to supper under the palace limes. They did not move into the palace. That was not their place, nor did they wish to. But a small, tidy cottage near the village was found for them, with a patch of garden that Clarice tended, slowly, carefully, learning patience from beans and beets. When she spoke kindly, the plants seemed to listen. Years passed, and under the gentle reign of the prince and his jewel-tongued queen, the kingdom flourished. Schools had warm fires in winter. Markets were fair. The old were cared for, and the young were heard. It was not the jewels that made it so. It was the way the queen greeted a soldier's wife by name, the way the king stopped to tie a child's shoe, the way the courtiers began to compete not in cleverness, but in kindness. Whenever the queen spoke in public, petals skated over the crowd like butterflies, and people smiled at one another as if remembering they belonged to the same song. Once, on a quiet afternoon, the queen walked past the palace well. She felt for a heartbeat the silvery presence of the fairy, as faint and sweet as a memory of roses. Marianne looked up and whispered, "Thank you." A single star-bright gem chimed on the stones, and oh, the way the air felt then, soft and hopeful. She knew the fairy had heard. In time, Clarice's toads grew rarer. When one did appear, plop! She laughed, scooped it up, and set it gently in the grass. "We're all learning," she would say, and practice again. As for the widow, she learned to praise softly and fairly, to listen before she judged, and to measure love not by the ribbons she could buy, but by the warmth of her table and the peace of her heart. Sometimes she would sit in her doorway at dusk and watch the fireflies come out. "Our words are lanterns," she would murmur, "best to light the path." And so, as stories are fond of saying, they lived happily, though not perfectly, ever after. The kingdom bloomed, not from magic alone, but from the courage to be kind. For everyone learned what Marianne's gift had whispered from the beginning, that words can plant gardens or thistles, and it is a brave and beautiful thing to grow a world where, when we speak, something lovely takes root.